In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint a watercolor gem. To get started, you're going to need some sort of gem template, watercolor paper, watercolors. You'll need a cup for dirty water and then a cup for clean water as well. And then some brushes. So I'm going to start with my template here, and I'm going to use a light box to trace it, but you can free draw it, or if you have a printout, you can color the back of it with your pencil lead, and then you can flip it over and trace on top of it, and you'll see it will transfer over onto your paper. So I have my design for my gem drawn here. So I'm going through and I'm adding a few drops of the clean water to the different colors that I'm going to use. So I'm going to use sort of a blue color scheme, a cool color scheme for this gem, and I'm transferring over some of the watercolor onto my palette. And so I just used the same turquoisey blue, but one of them I added a bit more water. And the reason that I'm doing that is I'm making it a nice transparent color turquoise here. So that first one has more water than this second one here. So you can see the second one is darker, and then what's left on my palette has the least amount of water, and that's the darkest. So by adding more water or less water, you can create a value scale with your colors. So I'm going to go through and add a little bit more colors to my palette just to get it prepared and ready before I start painting my gem. So I'm going to go through, and I already have this blue on my brush, so I'm going to start with that, and I'm just putting different washes and different techniques. So here I'm going to paint half of this triangle, the darker blue, and then I decided to add in sort of the lighter turquoise on the other end and blend that a little bit to create a gradient. And this one I'm painting it with just clear water, and then I dropped in some of that blue. So I'm using the wet and wet technique there. And you'll notice I'm painting in my triangles apart from one another, because what happens is if I were to paint two triangles that are right next to each other, they would start to bleed into one another. So you want to, as you're painting in each of these triangles, you want to space them apart until they're sort of dry next to one another. So once a triangle is dry, then I can go in and add new wet color next to it, and it won't bleed into the triangle that I previously painted. So again, always start by spreading your triangles apart when you're painting them. Once they are a little bit dry, and usually takes about 5 or 10 minutes until they're dry enough, then you can go back and start filling in the triangles that are adjacent or next to each other. So I'm painting this with lots of different techniques. Again, some are gradients, some are wet and wet, some are just washes, and I'm trying to leave my watercolor pretty transparent. So you don't want your watercolors to be very dry. If they are really shiny after they dry, that means you didn't use enough watercolor or enough water in your watercolor. So you want to be able to see through some of the paper underneath. So now here it's really dry, and really we could end there. That looks pretty good, but I'm going to go in and add even more detail. So I'm going and I'm painting in small triangles on top of the ones I previously painted. And the reason I can do this is because it was totally dry underneath, and that took about 10 minutes to dry. So I'm going through and just adding a bunch of different triangles within the triangles that I already painted. And what these little triangles represent are reflections, as well as some of the cuts that you can see through, because if this were a gem, you can kind of see through the gem. It's transparent, right? So after I painted in the triangles with some different darker blues, I went in, I'm using white, and I'm painting in triangles with my white watercolor. Now, if you want to make this pop even more, you could use white acrylic, but I have a nice clean white in my watercolor palette, so I'm just using that. So I went through and I painted in all the white. Now I'm going over some of my pencil lines with different shades of blue, or even I'm going to go back and cover some of those pencil lines in white to show those original triangles a little bit more. So the very last step, what I will do is I will mix up some white, and I'm just sort of splattering it over, and I'm not going overboard, but just putting a little splatters to show some sparkle. And now we're finished with our painting.